Welcome everyone to the Utah Humanities Book Festival. We'll give folks a chance to trickle in. It's been a very busy Saturday of events, and we have a very exciting week coming up. We have Debbie Lockwood in Weber County Library on Monday. And then we have two storytellers telling spooky stories in Orem Public Library on Monday at both of those at 7. Over on Wednesday, we have Ross Gay, who once won $100,000 for his poetry book collection, The Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. And he was also my thesis advisor. He's a wonderful human. There's a ton of cool events coming up, including Tara Westover next Saturday virtually, or if you're in St. George, you can sign up for the St. George Literary Arts Fest. And take advantage of some of the lineup that they have there. We started a little early, so I'm going to go ahead and run my mouth a little bit. Yes, to let a few more folks trickle into the room, but we're so happy that you're here and you're spending your Saturday with us. I'm so ready to talk about queer stuff and Mormon stuff. My name's Willie. We're going to give this just a little bit more and then we'll go ahead and get started. But I'm seeing good people in the room and we'll wait for a few more to trickle in. How are you doing, Lindsay?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having us. Our last event was really great. And so I'm excited to do this again.
Yeah, I am literally rendering the recording of the last event as we speak. It goes super slow on my dinosaur of a laptop, but it's going. It's almost halfway there.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you before we get started, because everyone wants to know if this is going to be recorded.
It is being recorded right now as we speak.
And it will be.
I will edit out all the goofiness at the beginning and, make sure it's just the meat of it when it's ready to be uploaded. But it is being recorded. So if you have any crimes you want to confess to, right now is the chance, Lindsay.
There's so many. It all started back in 6th grade.
Oh, gosh.
I don't know if anyone tuned in. I can't see the participants right now, but we did Mike Quinn's book last time, which was really great, his most controversial works. And now I'm excited to talk to Taylor. Every time Taylor and I have a discussion, it's super, super smart. So I feel like even if I was talking about like celebrity gossip with Taylor, he would be great.
Start roping in some grad school theories. And how are you doing over in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Taylor?
Pretty good. We're getting nice fall weather and cider donuts are out.
Cider donuts, what are those?
It's a northern United States and New England delicious treat that only happens in the fall. So yeah, they're pretty good.
Okay, we're at 6:03, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and folks who trickle in will just get to trickle in. My name is Willie Palomo. I'm the director of the Utah Humanities Book Festival, and this is our 24th annual year, and this is an annual free festival, which is our gift to the community, which allows folks to explore all sorts of ideas by interacting with great writers like Taylor, who we have in the room. You can see the complete program at utahhumanities.org, or if you're on Instagram or Twitter, at Utah Book Fest, and if you're on Facebook at Utah Humanities Book Festival. We have tons of stuff happening. There's hundreds of events all across the state, virtual and in person. And because there's so many, and because we work with so many different community partners, I like to tell people that, hey, there's a book out there for you and an author that's waiting to meet you in particular. We have that many books involved in this lineup. So if you have kids, if you're only into poetry, if you're only into sci-fi or fiction, there's going to be, a special event for you. We got to thank our major sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be able to throw these wonderful events. That's the George S. and Dolores Doris Eccles Foundation, Salt Lake City Arts Council, Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Fund, Summit County RAP, Weber County RAMP, the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, the King's English Bookshop, Weller Bookworks, the Book Bungalow, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Catalyst. We got through the list. All right, now we're heading over to the fun stuff, which is why we're here for. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to the wonderful Lindsay Hansen Park, the boss and the leader over at Sunstone Magazine, who's been doing a fantastic job organizing events, leading conferences, all sorts of stuff. We're super excited to have had the chance to collaborate with Sunstone and Lindsay for this Utah Humanities Book Festival, and I'll let you take it away, Lindsay.
Thank you. Thank you, Willie. We've really enjoyed this partnership. We've done a few fun things, and so we are concocting all kinds of things in the future. So more to come with that. But I'm really excited to do this because tonight I'm going to be talking to my second favorite person named Taylor in the world. And the first obviously being Taylor Swift. But Taylor Petrie is a close second. And we're going to talk about his book, Tabernacles of Clay. First of all, it's got a really cool cover, and what's inside is even better. So we're going to talk about that. But if you don't know, if this is your first engagement with this format or this evening, I am the executive director of the Sunstone Education Foundation. It's an open Mormon forum that's been around for about 45 years. It started as a magazine and now has grown into events and symposia every year. At the end of July, it's an open forum where you can talk about all kinds of Mormon topics. You don't have to be a Mormon or a believing Mormon. You just have to be interested in Mormonism. We have all kinds of wild topics to talk about. It's one of the few places that you can talk about anything in Mormonism in a thoughtful way and engage people that believe completely differently than you, and everyone seems to get along. And so we've had Taylor come before and present, and he's always great. I think you keynoted 2 years ago. Was that when it was? It was great. So I'm going to introduce Taylor, and then he's going to talk about his book, and then we're going to get into Q&A. So if you have questions, you can leave those in the chat or the Q&A on Zoom. And I've got some questions for him too that I've been cooking up since rereading the book again. So Taylor Petrie is an associate professor of religion at Kalamazoo College. He was visiting associate professor of women's studies and sexuality and research associate in the Women's Study in Religion program at Harvard Divinity School in 2016 through 17. He teaches biblical studies, gender studies, and theory and method in religious studies classes. Dr. Petrie received his PhD and MTS from Harvard Divinity School in New Testament and Early Christianity, and a BA in Philosophy and Religion from Pace University in New York City. Dr. Petrie has pursued 2 areas of study, early Christianity and Mormon studies. His research and scholarship focus on the intersection of postmodern gender studies and religion, methods of scriptural interpretation, and the impact of modernity on religion. Among his publications, he is the author of the book Resurrecting Parts, Early Christians and Desire, Reproduction and Sexual Difference, and a forthcoming, and this book, it's now out, Tabernacles of Clay, Sexuality and Sexual Difference in Modern Mormonism. And he is also the editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, and he's just doing all kinds of great things. So Taylor, what are you up to lately? Am I missing anything?
I think that about covers it, yeah.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and get started? And if you do have your book, pull it out and get ready for your questions.
All right. I am going to see if I can share my screen here. Is that possible? No, it doesn't look like it is. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, hold on. Let me get this going here. Let's see. Okay, is that coming through for everyone?
Yep, I can see it. Looks great.
Great. Okay. So thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to the Utah Humanities Book Festival for having me tonight. This is a really generous invitation, and I'm grateful for the hospitality to have such a wonderful conversation, and for the group that we can have the conversation with via this technology. It's pretty incredible that we can get to do this. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm here to talk about my book, Tabernacles of Clay, Gender and Sexuality in Modern Mormonism, which is a history, but one that tells the story of modern Mormonism and its relationship to gender and sexuality in an entirely new way. I don't start with polygamy, which is what I thought might be the obvious place to start, but rather with the period following World War II, where we see the confluence of the invention of homosexuality as a concept, the rise of the women's rights and civil rights movements, a new psychologized version of LDS teachings, all converging at this time period. And I argue that contemporary LDS teachings on gender and sexuality are forged most clearly in this context, rather than going back to Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or the beginnings of monogamous Mormonism or things along those lines. I began thinking about LDS teachings on gender and sexuality in the mid-2000s, Of course, Latter-day Saints were teaching things that were similar to other conservative Christians during this time period. But unlike those groups, I recognize that LDS teachings on the topic were not especially dependent on the Bible or a close reading of scripture, but rather a set of distinctive theological ideas about the nature of the human person. This engaged some of my own interests in philosophy of religion and critical theology of gender and sexuality that I was using in my graduate studies at the time on early Christianity, as Lindsay mentioned. As I continued to read and reflect on the topic, I saw more and more the importance of an accurate history. My sense is that the history that people seemed to know was either a history in which nothing ever changed. The Latter-day Saints had always taught the exact same thing, which sometimes relied on selectively cited past church leaders as evidence of a continued unbroken chain of teachings on gender and sexuality. Or people focused a history that was only on the changes in marriage practices between plural marriage and monogamy at the turn of the 20th century. I found similar patterns in the history of women that tended to focus on questions about agency, or the histories of homosexuality that tended to focus on questions of tolerance and persecution. These are all excellent questions, and I commend the scholarship to those who are interested. But I wanted something a little bit different. I was looking for something that would trace out the history of the concepts of sexuality, homosexuality, and sexual difference, and so on. So I began to research, and it took me in new directions on this topic that I think help us to better understand, first, that there actually is a history to be told here, not a story of unchanging doctrine, and that the story to be told is far more exciting and interesting than had been told before, at least to my eye. So the book tells a number of different stories that were surprising to me, at least as I researched them, including the role of sex and reproduction as it related to LDS teachings on race, the invention of new teachings on homosexuality, the role that psychology played in LDS understandings of gender, and how 20th century feminism intersects with LDS teachings in ways that hadn't been noticed before. I can't cover all of these stories, so instead, tonight I just want to briefly talk about one or two aspects of the story, and that's how Latter-day Saints think about the nature of gender. So I want to start a little bit in the middle of the story, and then I can work backwards and forwards from that point, but it's a point that's a pivot point in history. Is my screen still sharing, by the way? I'm getting a little notification. I apologize.
Yep, it's working for me.
Still working. Okay, I apologize. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so starting from this middle point here of the 1995, the family, a proclamation to the world. Many of the people who are watching this will certainly know that in September of 1995, the relatively new LDS Church president, Gordon B. Hinckley, stands at the Global Women's Meeting and delivers a short statement titled "The Family." The document was a huge sensation. It defined a generation of LDS teachings. People hung and hang copies on their wall. There are BYU classes which are now devoted to this 612-word document, something like that. It lays out some of the basic teachings on gender roles, children, marriage, but it also includes this warning. We warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote these measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. So there's a political call here. The document, I think, makes sense in light of what other conservative churches and political groups are doing in this period. The family was a key topic of the religious right. The religious right was a loose coalition of conservative Catholics, evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants, and Latter-day Saints that all banded together to oppose such things as abortion, women's rights, gay rights, public education, pornography, and birth control. They became active in the 1970s, but reached a major peak in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, and were a key constituent in his coalition, and they have been an indispensable one for Republican politics ever since. Now, these are strange bedfellows. They all have pretty strong feelings against one another, but they're kind of the leftovers from the more liberal and mainstream ecumenical movements after World War II. They put together in the 1980s and 1990s a number of these proclamations, manifestos, charters, things along these lines that all kind of communicated similar teachings to that we see in the LDS iteration. I just list a number of them there, and I show a picture of the Family Manifesto, which was put together in 1988 by the Moral Majority, Eagle Forum, Family Research Council, and other groups representing an evangelical perspective. The Family Manifesto document explained that, quote, marriage is a covenant of divine origin. On gender roles, it affirmed, quote, we proclaim that male and female were established by the Creator in their diversity with equal dignity and complementary value, and that gender extends to psychological traits which set natural constraints on gender roles. The role of the male is most effectively that of provider, and the role of female one of nurturer. The Family Manifesto promoted procreation, and it outlined its views on the rights of children. It further called on society to enact specific proposals that would ensure that marriage is, quote, protected by government in public policy. Other organizations, as I mentioned, released similar documents. I won't go over all of them here, but by the mid-1990s, these ambitions really were bearing fruit in political documents, such as the 1995 Contract with America. It was called the Contract with the American Family, which was an extension of the 1994 Contract with America under Newt Gingrich's congressional campaign. There are also others that happen after this, such as Article 18, which emphasized in the Southern Baptist Convention, which emphasized heterosexual marriage and declared that both male and female were equal partners, but also that wives should submit to their husbands. So listeners who are familiar with the proclamation will recognize many of the shared themes between these documents and the LDS version. But the LDS version is actually much more mild than some of these others. It doesn't address concerns about public education or abortion. It doesn't say that wives must submit, as many of the other versions did. Instead, it lays out a theological perspective that's both familiar to other conservative religious organizations, but also has some slight differences. Among the familiar ideas is the idea that gender is an essential feature of identity, essential meaning unchanging. And it offers a defense of traditional gender roles in heterosexual marriage, grounded in the Bible, most especially, I think, for the proclamation, Genesis 1-3, and the Adam and Eve story, where it which it references several times. And the document ends up sort of highlighting a theological problem that Latter-day Saints are going to be wrestling with ever since. The theological problem, in brief, is that Latter-day Saints believe that God is in a heterosexual relationship with a divine female figure. These beings may sexually reproduce in order to create the spirits of human beings. And this relationship then provides a template for human relationships, both because they're supposedly non-reproductive and because they exclude either male or the female and are therefore not complementary. This idea is heretical in Christian tradition, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense if you start to think about it too much in general. But Mormons have very strongly defended the idea that there is a Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother who are in a reproductive relationship that becomes the model for all relationships that are sort of authorized by God and by the church. So this text then has a number of distinctive teachings, including the idea of eternal marriage, which again are different from other conservative Christian traditions, and in some ways which make the issue of same-sex relationships even more acute. But one of the questions that I had that I wanted to unpack a little bit is how we get to the idea that gender is eternal. And I want to read a quote from just 3 decades before the proclamation from church president. He wasn't church president at the time. He was at the time an apostle, Joseph Fielding Smith. He wrote a popular column called Answers to Gospel Questions, in which Latter-day Saints would write to him questions, and then he would answer them from Scripture. And one of the questions that he got was, how is it going to be possible to keep people who are living in the next life as unmarried because they weren't married in the celestial kingdom, they weren't sealed in the celestial kingdom? How are we going to keep all of them from having sex? And here's his answer. Is not the sectarian world justified in their doctrine, generally proclaimed, that after the resurrection, there will neither be male or female sex? It is a logical conclusion for them to reach, and is apparently in full harmony with what the Lord has revealed regarding the kingdoms into which evidently the vast majority of mankind is likely to go. This idea that the vast majority of mankind, or of human beings, would be neither male nor female in the resurrection was for him a logical conclusion and in harmony with the revelations of the Lord. So how do we go from there being neither male and female for the vast majority of human beings to the idea that gender is an essential characteristic? I try to answer that question in brief with the book in laying out the transitions that church teachings are undergoing, at least as one part of all of this story. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll turn it back to Lindsay, who I think had some questions, and then we can open it up for larger discussion and conversation among the group. Is that a good place to stop, Lindsay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Especially, you kind of took one of my questions away, so I'll get into something else. But the very first question I want to ask you is one that I think has come up a few times, probably for you, and I know for other folks who are engaging this subject. So it's this idea of sort of carving out a pathway of understanding for LGBT folks in the church. I think people see, just the book cover alone, and they think, oh, is he trying to say that you can be gay and be Mormon, which is not what your book is about at all. But I want to talk about that topic for a minute. What would you say to people who don't even want to engage the history or the topic of LGBT issues in the church because they think it's so futile, it's so incompatible with modern LDS teachings and understandings? Why should people be learning more about this subject?
Yeah. It's such a great question, and there's more to say about it, but let me kind of describe 3 different approaches that I think people have taken to this topic and kind of where I situate myself in all of that. One is, I think, a pastoral approach, right? Which is how to either live in the tradition or to step away from the tradition and live a life which is, as full of joy as possible, one which is authentic to oneself, the things along those lines. And again, I think we see various versions of this from, Why I Left to Why I Stay and everywhere in between. And the people who are best equipped to talk about that are the people who live it, and who have gone through it themselves. I'm a straight man. It's not something that I can really speak to, at the personal level there. But I think that those are important conversations to be had. When I started thinking about the topic originally, I saw the importance and the value of those pastoral approaches, but I really wanted to think through what I saw a set of theological problems that the church had in facing this issue. And I felt that the pastoral issues kind of bumped up against the limitations that the theology itself provided for where LGBT folks stand in the cosmos, in the Mormon cosmos, And so when I first came to this topic about a decade ago or so, a little more than that, I was interested in tackling this as a theological problem. So some of my early publications are along the theology. And the responses to that kind of pushed me in a new direction. One of the responses one of the kinds of responses was basically like, okay, well, this is all interesting and good as a theoretical exercise on paper. You could say, okay, but the Latter-day Saint tradition might be able to accommodate same-sex relationships, but it's not authentic to the history itself. You know, history is this unbroken tradition of heterosexuality and so on. You know, and gender is essential, and that's what we've always taught. And so when I turned in this book to thinking about the history as a problem, I wanted to destabilize the self-assured idea that the history had never changed and say, no, actually the history has changed. It's changed a lot, and it's changed very recently, much more recently than most people realize. And so as a way of, I think, kind of having an honest conversation about the place of LGBT saints in the church, in the cosmos, I felt like we really needed to have the history told in such a way that made change not only possible, but very much a part of the story as it's developed up until this point.
That's perfect. And speaking of that accommodation that you were talking about earlier, maybe you could talk about the article that sort of predated this book first, because that's how I first found out about your work. And that article was meant to, and tell me if this is wrong, sort of set out a path in the theology that would accommodate LGBT lifestyles, which is not what the book is. So we'll talk about the book in a minute, but do you want to talk about your article and point people to it for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So the article is called "Toward a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology." It was published in Dialogue in 2011. And I wanted to really take seriously the theological objections to same-sex relationships. You know, I think a lot of people, again, in the pastoral approach, were kind of calling for tolerance and understanding. And I, again, thought that those were really critical issues to be thinking about. But I wanted to answer the issue of like, well, what does the afterlife look like for people who want to be in same-sex relationships, you know? And so I tried to kind of take seriously what the objections would be in the Latter-day Saint tradition around celestial reproduction, around heterosexual kinship as kind of being the only thing that we've ever done or something. And I look back in our tradition, I do some history in that piece too. I look back in the tradition and again say, this is not the only thing. We have not only ever taught that celestial beings reproduce and that's why you have to be married in heaven. There are lots of other alternatives in the temple that we go to. We don't teach that. We have a narrative about creation that's entirely different, where two male characters create Adam and then create Eve from Adam's body. You know, we have these totally non-heterosexual narratives there. And I wanted to look at those as alternative starting points for thinking about LDS theology. So that's kind of what the article is about. I'll just add one more piece, which is that I wanted us to be authentic as a tradition to thinking about families and thinking about marriage. We're a tradition that has been quite experimental in the past, I guess you could say, on some of these issues. And so I wanted to look at that and think about the kind of core issues there as being around kinship making. And so my personal theology starts with kinship as a potential solution to the dilemma that Latter-day Saints find themselves in for having exclusionary ideas about marriage. That if we start thinking about marriage less about heterosexuality and more as one way of forming kinship, that we might be able to have a broader and more inclusive understanding. So that's kind of where I started that approach. And as I said, in seeing the responses to that article and the various new scholars and new approaches that have developed since then, the history became really important to me. And so I turned to that.
That's great. Thank you. And I definitely recommend everyone look at the article. It was pretty groundbreaking, I would say, in not just how it, uncovered some theological pathways for our tradition, but also I think that the history of it was really important too. So back to the book, is it fair to say that the overarching thesis of the book shows how Mormon doctrine and approaches to gender and sexuality is the result of cultural and societal pressures rather than divine mandates?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's a good way of putting it. And well, I guess I don't know if I want to say entirely that that's a binary, that they either are the result of one or the other, but certainly that one cannot exclude the possibility that cultural forces have dramatically shaped the conservative LDS theology that has developed in the last 60, 70 years. This is not spring out of Latter-day Saint tradition, but is closely aligned with broader trends of conservative religious doctrines, and not just in the abstract, but in the actual connections and formations that Latter-day Saints are making in the religious right. We're meeting with them, we're forming organizations with them, we're making political efforts together, and are coordinating our language together with other conservative Christians. So it's not just like, oh, we saw them on TV. No, they're meeting privately to discuss these issues and working out the doctrines here. And so very much it's impossible to not understand the origins of Latter-day Saint teachings as being intimately intertwined with broader conservative culture in the last 70 years.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, my next question is, you talk about eroding boundaries between male and female members in your book as a reason for shift in approaches to gender. So I want you to, if you can, talk about what that means and what some of those eroding boundaries are.
Yeah, can you just say the first part of the question one more time, Lindsay? Sorry.
In your book, you talk about eroding boundaries between male and female relationships within LDS context, and that was kind of a new thing for me because I hadn't looked at that before. So, talk about what those eroding boundaries are and how that shifts how we approach gender in Mormonism.
Yeah, and you might remind me if there's something specific that you're interested, like some specific examples that you wanted me to talk about there.
So what you were talking about is as the World War II culture sort of shifts everything, men and women and the way that they engage and interact each other starts to shift. And because of that, it's almost as if the theology or the doctrine, whatever we want to call it, is a response to gender rules and relationships.
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question. So, we have after World War II, and really during World War II, dramatic changes in gender roles in the country. Women go to work during World War II, and then when they come home, they're suddenly just fired from their jobs so that men can have them again. And they're Rosie the Riveter is out on the street now, right? Or back in the kitchen as they wanted her to be, right? So we have all of these changes going on. And then we have the women's liberation movement, feminist movements that are coming along. And there starts to be this anxiety in the church that patriarchy specifically is under attack in the culture, more broadly, and specifically in the church. And there's a kind of very urgent defense of patriarchy that then takes place during that time period. We see the diminishment of the Relief Society's power and independence. Their publications are taken away. We have really an attempt to patriarchalize the church again after World War II in ways that we hadn't seen in a very long time. And so there are all these kinds of changes that are happening there. And it's a response to feminism. It's really, women's rights, women's authority in the church decreases during this time period because the church is really concerned about reaffirming patriarchy as the only way. And so they kind of push back very strongly. There are long periods in the church where women are not allowed to pray in sacrament meeting at all, ever, right? And so we see a huge retreats in terms of women's power and authority during this time period. This sparks, of course, then the new wave of Mormon feminism among other groups in Boston and around the country, which are kind of responding to this. It culminates in several excommunications. It's a tension inside the church. But yeah, the church is really worried then about that patriarchy is going to go away. And But over time, there is a kind of softening of that. Patriarchy never goes away. Of course, no Latter-day Saint would argue that patriarchy has gone away in the church at all. But there are softening, what I call soft egalitarianism or a softened patriarchy that takes hold, where you can have a document like the proclamation, which says that husband and wife are equal partners. That's not something that church leaders would have taught in the 50s, 60s, or 70s in any way. In fact, they explicitly taught that that was not the case over and over and over again. So the idea that we sort of evolved to this notion of equal partners is one of those accommodations that the church makes to feminism during that time period. But it shows that tension shows how this potential slippage between male and female has to be reaffirmed first by patriarchy and then later by heterosexuality. But that worry that male and female could just go away if there wasn't patriarchy shows up in their teachings, like the teachings that we saw of Joseph Fielding Smith, where he said that there isn't going to be male and female in the next life for the vast majority of humankind. And the reason why is because they didn't follow their gender roles well enough. And so therefore they don't get to keep their gender at all. And so they are worrying about a unisex society that's coming. And, if we get rid of, if women are allowed to wear pants, then they're going to be lesbians because they're going to have mannish desires. I mean, I'm not an exaggeration. This is literally what they are saying at the time period. And so, they become very worried that about androgynous culture, about punk rock music in the 70s and David Bowie. Who knows what they're thinking about, right? But they start to see those erosions of gender roles as leading to an erosion of marriage, as leading to homosexuality, as leading to the end of patriarchy, and so on. And they're really trying to navigate through that world that's changing under their feet. First, by fighting really hard against it, and then later by trying to accommodate some changes that they think are acceptable.
Brilliant. And one of the things that really, really stuck out to me in the book that I hadn't considered before, studying the progressive era, this idea of the anxiety that society felt, but men specifically, especially in our culture, about after World War II, and we have women in the workforce now, what are men going to do? They have marriage bars enacted in Utah, which means that if you're a married woman, you can't work because you're taking a job from a man. And so this idea that this anxiety is stemming from the insecurity of men is interesting. But the thing that you really do that kind of blew my mind was you talk about the 20th century focus in the church to bring patriarchal, the patriarchal institution and order into the home, and reinforcing patriarchy in the home. And I had never really thought about it that way because I grew up with that. So it was just kind of, that's Mormonism, I know. But if you know anything about early Mormonism, it wasn't so defined that the men and the women do this in the home. It was a little bit more collaborative. So you talk about, reinforcing patriarchy in the home. You've kind of answered that in your last question, but do you want to have any more specific examples about that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people kind of assumed that for church leaders that it would have been like the women's domain is the home and the man's domain is outside of the home, the kind of public-private distinction, that the private world belongs to women and the public world belongs to men. But that's not actually what church leaders are saying during the kind of height of the patriarchal period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're saying that that men run the home also, and are really adamant that men take their place as the head of the household. And they're very concerned with the idea that women might exert too much power and control in the home. And so the church institutes a number of practices during this time period to train men about how to be fathers and leaders in the home, to take responsibility for spiritual matters in the home. The Family Home Evening Program is instituted in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s, with a manual that comes out, both one directly for the program itself and a separate one for the priesthood organization lesson manual that talks over and over and over again about men as being at the head of the home and taking on this role. And then the home teachers are supposed to then go in and check to make sure that men are occupying this role. And if not, then they're the substitute men to take over, to sort of be the male role models in the home. And, just a few years later, the wives are already complaining that the husbands aren't doing the family home evening program, that they're taking on, they're doing the whole thing. And, they have to decide who prays, and they have to make the treats, and they have to do all the work for the family home evening program. And Spencer W. Kimball gets up and says, I am surprised to learn that there are some men that aren't calling on people to give prayers in their home, and they're letting their wives take that over, again, really trying to reinforce, like, no, men, this is your responsibility to be the teacher, the leader, the patriarch of the home. So there are all kinds of programs that the church is engaged in during that time period to kind of move not just patriarchy in the church, but to make sure that it's happening in the home as well.
That was a really important insight for me to realize, because, most of my work focuses on Mormon polygamy, obviously. And, in early Utah periods up until the 20th century, you have polygamous husbands who are gone the majority of their wives' time. If you're sharing the home, even with 3 or 4 wives across the frontier, you're traveling a lot. There's not a man in the home, and we have women blessing and healing and doing a lot of roles that would be seen as sort of heretical now. And I didn't realize that the shift happened as a way to, institute this patriarchy in the home. And of course, as a Mormon feminist myself, we've seen so many problems stem out of this idea that men control the home as well. And I've been in situations where I have the man in the family asks everyone to pray. He assigns people to pray. It's still very much something that is alive and well in a lot of families. I want to talk about civil rights for a minute. You go in depth about the church's opposition to social movements, more feminism, civil rights, and things like that. But I think it's in your introduction, you start out by saying that the resistance that the church has to these movements is often short-lived. So can we talk about what the oppositions are? And then I want to talk about what you mean when you say that the opposition is short-lived.
Yeah, so the church in nearly every sort of major civil rights movement over the last several decades has initially opposed those movements. The feminist movement, the civil rights movement, and again, to drill down more specifically on those, that manifested in the church's opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s and early 1980s, which initially it wasn't opposed to, and most members actually supported, as did most conservatives in general. But over the course of the mid-1970s, with the rise of the religious right, the church flips sides on this and really comes out strongly against it. And it's the first time that the church joins with other religious groups to take on some of these issues, at least in the post-World War II era. And it forms a kind of groundwork for a lot of their then later activism and opposition on political issues. The church has a mixed relationship on civil rights legislation in general. So there were some members of the senior leadership that were very opposed to it, and some members of the senior leadership that were pretty okay with it. And so there was a little bit of a civil war over civil rights in the 1960s in the church. That eventually the pro-civil rights faction wins, and the church takes a much more positive, or at least more neutrally positive, stance towards civil rights and silences some of the key opponents of the civil rights movement. But you also see in the 1960s and the 1970s, the church started to take on other issues of wanting to ban pornography legally, of opposing legalization of sodomy, which was we started to see overturning of anti-sodomy laws, and the church is getting involved in opposing those. And this kind of culminates then in same-sex marriage, of course, in the 1990s and 2000s, as the church gets involved in some of these. We've seen the church sort of flirt a little bit with anti-trans legislation programs that they've kind of gotten involved in or signed amicus briefs on. And when I say that they're short-lived, I think that we can often go back and find the way that that the church kind of made peace on a lot of these issues. With civil rights, obviously, as I said, they reversed their positions on that, including at the level of interracial marriage, which was one of the biggest issues that they were really concerned with. The church certainly still opposes the Equal Rights Amendment, as they made clear a couple of years ago, but it doesn't occupy the same kind of, anti-feminism doesn't occupy the same level of attention that it once did, and is a much more muted form. And I don't mean to say that it's gone, but I just want to contrast what we see now with the kind of stuff that we saw back in the 1970s and 80s. And then I think even on the issues of same-sex marriage and LGBT rights, the church changed its position between the 1990s and the 2000s, where they came to at least be open to the idea of civil unions at various points as an alternative, whereas in an earlier period, they were not open to that at all. So again, I think that we can see often a softening or a changing or some kind of attempt to find a middle position or a compromise along the way.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions. Now I have some questions from other folks. One of the questions, you probably get this a lot, is do you think the church will ever change their position on LGBT issues?
Oh man, I wish I knew the answer to that question, because I could probably sell a lot more books if I knew the future, right? I don't know the future. I think that there are 2 or 3 directions that the church might go. I think it's very possible that we don't make any changes at all, that we maybe even go backwards a little bit. There are occasional kind of grumblings, it seems, from senior church leaders, including from Elder Holland as of, less than a month ago, saying we're going to go down with this on this issue. No matter what it costs, we're going to stick to our guns on this point. And and so that's very possible that the church just says this is something that we cannot compromise on whatsoever. And they seem to be indicating to us that right now, at least, that's their position, that they are willing to suffer the social consequences for the church permanently, but because they don't think that it's something that they can make any changes on. The other direction that the church might go is to take a sort of middle route in some way to try to make some accommodations. We've seen the way that the church did this on with respect to feminism, for instance, did not solve the problem, right? We don't have women with the priesthood. We don't have women holding, doing blessings again. We don't have a kind of return to even really an earlier era of women's power and authority in the church in some respects. But the church somehow survived that by making enough accommodations, by saying, okay, well, women and men can be equal in marriages, if not equal in church, right? Women and men can, women can work. This was a big thing that the church opposed for a really long time, was women working, as you mentioned, right? We're going to have women in ward council. We're going to make all of the other changes that we possibly can, but not ever cross that line. And, as I said, the church has more or less gotten by with that position. It hasn't satisfied everyone, but it's still around, right? And then the other option that the other direction that the church might go is what it did on race, which is to more or less repudiate its past reliance on racial science, on a theology of racial lineages and divinely ordained racial boundaries, and say we don't teach that anymore. That was a weird thing that we did for a little while, but that's not the core message of the gospel, and we can just move beyond that and get past it. And it might take them several decades to do that. Occasionally we still see teachings, quotations of church leaders who oppose interracial marriage popping up in BYU classes. It always seems to be at BYU Idaho for whatever reason. We still see the remnants of that. But for the most part, the church has attempted at least to turn its back on those and to repair the damages that had been done by those earlier teachings. And so it's possible that the church might go in that direction as well. That doesn't seem to be what they're signaling right now, that they're open to that, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility either.
Thank you. I'm going to ask 2 other questions, and then we'll see if Willie has anything for you. So this is from our Zoom chat from Bob Allender. That Joseph Fielding Smith quote, how is it that he can say that? Where is it taught that only in the celestial kingdom will be gendered and those in the terrestrial telestial kingdom will be degendered?
So the broader context for what he's teaching, he's sort of grounding this in 19th century ideas from Parley and Orson Pratt. So if you read the full, I don't go into all of this in the book, and it wasn't useful to tell all of the history, but they suggested that there was a kind of hierarchical difference between the types of bodies that one has in the different kingdoms. And they're getting this directly from 1 Corinthians 15, which is that there are celestial bodies, terrestrial bodies, and telestial bodies. And they say that's talking about bodies, and the bodies are going to have these different characteristics, and that you'll be able to look at a body and say, oh, that's a celestial body. Oh, that's a terrestrial body. That's a telestial body. And so what Joseph Fielding Smith is doing is he's sort of expanding on that. He's saying, you know what they're talking about? He says they're talking about these physical characteristics that are going to be different. It's going to be in the genitals, right? That's going to be the obvious place where you see the differences, this hierarchy of bodies. And the hierarchy of bodies is that the gendered bodies, or the sexually differentiated bodies, are the celestial ones. And then they're going to be these androgynous, neither male nor female bodies in the lower kingdoms. So that's kind of where he's drawing it, is really from the LDS theological tradition and the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 15. The other place that he's drawing it from is Galatians 3:28, which says that there is neither male nor female in Christ Jesus. And he in fact quotes Galatians 3:28 twice in the 2 times that he teaches this or that he writes about this. He refers to Galatians 3:28 as the proof text for it. So that's kind of where he's getting at, the scriptural and the LDS historical tradition.
That's a perfect segue to this question. So Janet asks, I am an intersex woman. I have had personal and private conversations with a general authority. How is it that the church general authorities and leaders continue to disregard the experience of intersex members? Yeah. Can you speak to just intersex individuals in the church? Obviously, they're aware that gender is not as binary as they seem to make it in their theology. What is it that, when they're confronted with issues, like Janet says, of intersex bodies, how does the church deal with that?
Yeah. Well, Janet, I'd love to hear about your conversations with general authorities. I'd hard to be a fly on the wall in that. But intersex bodies have long been known among senior church leaders to pose a real problem in the theology, and there is no answer. I think Janet maybe would know as well as anybody that they don't have a good answer for this issue. They have used very unfortunate and dehumanizing language in the past around accidents of nature, to sort of see this as a sort of aberration from the norm or disability, all these kinds of things, rather than just confront the reality of nature as producing non-binary bodies, bodies which can't be categorized as either male or female according to the artificial rules that we developed to decide the differences there. So I think it remains an unresolved theological issue. And I say that it's been a long time because it goes all the way back to the 1970s, at least. So there was an article in Dialogue. It uses some old language, a little old-fashioned language, but it's about the problem of intersex bodies for LDS theology. LDS evolutionary biologists have been pointing this issue out for decades now. And the lived experiences of people like you, Janet, and others who have had private conversations. I've heard of many intersex people who have said that I've had private conversations with general authorities and they just shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And so I think that looking to those experiences, looking to those bodies is a great starting point for kind of undoing this gender binary that we think exists but doesn't.
Thank you. And Willie, do you have anything to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I do have some questions actually. And I feel like they're going to mostly fall under just trying to understand how the church is making sense of trans people now, because there's been some updated rhetoric with new prophets and stuff like that. But before I say that, I did have a comment about, I actually was taught the telestial terrestrial body thing, the celestial being gendered, when I was in seminary in the aughts. So it was something that was very much still being transmitted to me in like 2010, 2009 in seminary. To go back to the question, as far as trans folks go and the relationship with the church, how is that accommodation and conversation kind of happening? What I am aware of is that there are some trans like men who have held the priesthood and things like that. And I'm just curious what you were able to find as far as like the church officially, institutionally grappling with the issue of trans folks.
Yeah. First of all, the story that you were still being taught the Joseph Fielding Smith stuff in the late 2000s is so interesting to me, because again, I want to point out that the idea that gender is an eternal teaching is not only something which is historically contingent in the church, and before 1995, that there were people who didn't believe that before 1995, but the people don't believe it after 1995 and are continuing to teach these other models, or at least teaching them side by side. I'm sure you were taught the proclamation also, right? But to be teaching these two things side by side when they are not compatible at all, right, is fascinating to me. Trans accommodation. This is a great question, and a good thing. And I don't remember off the top of my head all of the policy changes, but in February of 2020, the church issued some updated guidelines on trans issues that had been developed, apparently, I've been told, in consultation with a number of LGBT activists who kind of helped them shape some new policies. But the history of how we got there is a pretty interesting one. The church became concerned about trans identities and trans issues a little bit later than you might expect. It's already in the 1950s that trans surgeries are happening and that are being talked about nationally. People knew about trans issues all the way back then. It wasn't off people's radar. And according to Greg Prince, there was even a known trans member who was sealed in the temple in the 1970s. He tells that story in his book and has access to some different sources. He knew the case personally. But in the 1980s, in the beginning of the 1980s, we start to see some policies coming down which basically say that anyone who has what's called an elective transsexual surgery would be excommunicated from the church and more or less barred from baptism into the church if they are a convert, without special permission from the first presidency. And that policy more or less lasts up until 2020. There are minor changes along the way, but it didn't cover a huge range of trans experiences. And I think that that's where they wanted to sort of come out in February of 2020 with some updated guidelines. One was that most trans people do not undergo surgical transition. Many do, but most do not, or at least not, bottom surgery. Again, it happens. It's not to say it's not common, but many people do not. It's expensive. It's a surgery. All kinds of reasons. And so there were cases of trans people who were showing up who were like, well, I haven't had elective surgery. I'm just wearing a dress, or I'm wearing a suit, or, I just prefer that you call me by this name instead. That's not a surgery. And the policy didn't really cover those people, right? So there was a lot of ambiguity. This happens with Lori Lee Hall, who's, I don't know all of the details of her case, but a former stake president, former employee of the church, designed the temple's architecture, and transitions not long, I think, while she was still stake president, and is released, but doesn't undergo any surgical change, but is still excommunicated. And it's like, well, there's no violation of the policy here, right? So there are these ambiguous cases that are happening, and it's unclear where the church can again make changes and accommodations. In February 2020, they developed some new ones where I think surgery is still prohibited, except in the case of intersex transitions, where if an intersex individual, they sort of treat those as a distinct case of trans identity, as opposed to cis, male bodies to female bodies or something. And they say that you can have your preferred name be used in church, and I think even on the on the LDS Tools app, in your ward, that your preferred name would show up. Might not be on the records of church. Again, I'd have to go back to the policy, but it's some interesting changes where they're trying to make some accommodations there, whereas before it had been outright prohibited. So I think in the last 10 years, and really in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen some pretty dramatic attempt to reconcile or reckon with this issue in public ways, where before that, I mean, you can, before 2010, before 2013, you can barely find any public cases of trans members that sort of made the media. I know that there were some, but that actually made the media or that people were paying attention to. But you're exactly right to ask this, because this is one of the big issues today that members are confronting.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That was my question, Lindsay.
Perfect. Thank you. Oops, let me get my video. Okay. Yeah. Thank you again, Taylor, for giving us this time. I know that you're busy doing important things, and I just want to remind everyone to pick up the book at support your local bookshop. Pick it up there. If not, you can get it online. It's really great. It's fascinating in history and culture, and even I am learning new things every time I read it. So thank you, Taylor. Taylor, is there anything that you're working on that you want to point us to?
Nothing that's ready for public consumption yet, but maybe someday. There'll be something.
Plug the latest issue of Dialogue, because it's incredible.
Thank you for bringing this one up. I'm really, really happy for this one. We have a special issue dedicated to Mormonism and indigeneity, where we feature scholarship and first-person voices on the interrelationship between indigenous perspectives and indigenous cultures, historically and today. Experiences, as I said, to modern experiences, to poetry, to fiction, to some beautiful fictional stories about the conflict and opportunities that can emerge at the intersection of Mormonism and indigeneity. And just really, really proud of that issue. So thank you for asking about it.
And the art is so beautiful too.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you, Willie. I'll turn it over to you, but thanks again for this partnership and opportunity.
Wonderful. As you exit the webinar, you'll get a short survey. If you can answer that, we'd appreciate it. It helps us get funding for things. Other than that, just keep your eyes looking for, new Utah Humanities Book Festival events. Tomorrow we have Prayers Not Meant for Heaven with Nan Seymour. We have Ross Gay on Wednesday, and there's a whole bunch of fun stuff for y'all to check out. So thank you so much for spending time with us, Taylor, and I'm gonna end the Zoom meeting.
Thank you.